Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the second clinic on digital solutions for social protection responses to COVID-19, outreach, registration, and enrollment. My name is Rodolfo Beasley. I'm a social protection specialist working with SPACE, and it is my pleasure to guide you through this clinic. So the idea of the clinic, the objective of the clinic is to have a virtual live space for learning, interaction, and knowledge sharing on practical issues related to outreach, registration, and enrollment for social protection programs in response to the pandemic. As we all know, the scale of the crisis has imposed a huge challenge to social protection programs, in particular in relation to reaching new segments of the population, while also safeguarding social distancing and other health-related measures. This is why outreach, registration, and enrollment is such a hot topic currently, and a very interesting one. And this is why we are looking forward to hearing your views, your questions, and the experiences that you are aware of. So this clinic is hosted by SPIAC-D, a digital social protection working group, and SPACE, which is an expert facility funded by FCDO and GDC. I am the moderator, and we have an exciting list of experts, and this list is not updated, so there are even others. So we are looking forward to hearing from all of you about your views in relation to this interesting topic. So while I'll explain how we are gonna organize and conduct this clinic, let me kindly ask you to go to Slido. There is a link that should be available in the chat box, and you can see that there are already questions there for the clinic. You can vote for the questions that you think are most interesting, and also you can post new questions. And we're going to use these questions to guide the exchange. So now we take a few minutes to do that, and meanwhile, let me explain you the dynamics a little bit. So Slido ranks the questions based on the likes, and so I'm gonna read the questions that are prioritized, and I'm gonna ask who is interested in answering the question. You can express your interest using the thumbs up button, or you can even indicate that in the chat box, no? And we want to make this clinic very participatory, and for everyone to answer the questions, not just the experts. And I guess I'll ask probably three people to answer each question. Let's see how it goes. And please do keep your interventions very short. I would say like 3 minutes maximum or so. Also, while you keep posting questions, let me say that this discussion about outreach, registration, and enrollment is going to continue after the clinic. There is a discussion forum, and so for that discussion forum, we're going to use a Google document. We're going to reflect all the issues discussed in the clinic, and we are also going to answer any remaining questions, and we're going to share material and so on. So the link to the Google document should be available in the chat box as well. And the other thing to mention is that you can post questions on Slido even after the clinic. If there is any other question that you may have, you can do that until the 8th of October. Okay, good. So now, so what we're gonna do is, let me stop sharing my. So please keep going through the slide of questions. Okay, so let's start with the conversation. What we're going to do now is I'm going to read the question that has been prioritized. I'm also going to copy and paste it in the chat box just for. And please, if there is anyone, I'm sure there are many of you interested in answering the question, let me know and we take it from there. So the first question is about, so the person is asking, I would like to know more about countries that have used the social registries for selecting beneficiaries to COVID responses without collecting new data, but using what they already had. Was that data enough? Did they have to ask for data updates? What are the lessons learned? So this is basically about using pre-existing social registry data for COVID responses. Let me paste the question here. Okay, so let me start by asking Alan, who is raising his hand, to answer this question, and then we move on to others. Alan.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Rodolfo. Just to flag, we recently put out a policy paper, a short policy paper, summarizing the use of digital mechanisms along the whole social transfer value chain, including the enrollment, the screening, and the payments. And some participants might find this useful because it does deal with many of the questions that are raised. Just on this one, someone has to kick off, so I'll do it. Countries are different. There are some countries that have social registries that are very limited, and others have social registries that cover a large part of the population, which is not currently beneficiaries. So I think one of the problems is that it's very difficult to update a social registry very rapidly in an emergency. You can't really do that, right? And the coverage of the social registry will not be enough to deal with the demands of the new poor who arise, like the informal workers and people who are not covered. So there will be a need to reach beyond the social registry. And I see two issues with the social registry data. The one is the gaps that I'm talking about now, very big gaps. And the other is that it may not be updated. And so as a result, there are those two problems, right? And if we look across countries, we see some examples like in Pakistan, where they were able to use the National Social and Economic Registry. And that was helpful because they could pick on households that were in the very lowest poverty category, and they could assign them. But for households that were above, they had to go through another screening process. And in that case, that was at local levels. So the registry helps, but it doesn't solve the problem. And then we see that in other countries, they are supplementing the registry by inviting people to apply, and then if they can, doing a variety of screenings against a whole range of other databases. For example, I believe Brazil uses about 20 different databases that they screen against to try to knock out people who they think may not be the highest priority. So I would say it's not enough, but it's very helpful, and helpful when you're able to link it to other types of data that can be used to screen. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. So if you want to answer, please either react by using the thumbs up function or just let me know through the chat box. Otherwise, I'm gonna start asking people to answer. Okay, good. Anybody else interested in answering this question? I see that Tanya is raising her hand. Tanya Nino, I'll let you answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I was trying to put the thumb, but I didn't find it. Thank you, Rodolfo. I just want to bring the Colombia experience, because I think I found it very interesting. Before the COVID, the COVID hit the country, they were preparing, the government were preparing now the fourth version of the social registry that is based on the means test. So it's supposed that it was very up to date. So it will be easy to use. So when the COVID strike, the government declared an emergency and issued a set of decrees. And with decrees, they were able to use the newest version that wasn't published, but they could use it. And they also approved the exchange, the data sharing between several databases within the government and with the private sector, including mobile operators, but also banks. So I think it was very extraordinary. They're trying to find the people who were beneficiaries of the traditional large cash transfer programs in the country. I think they reach over 3 million families, but I think we have like 4 lessons out of this. One is that even if the newest version of the Minstead was up to date, people changes the contact details very often. There is kind of a relation between vulnerability and permanent change of contact details. And we need to find out why this is happening. The second, there were the new poor, and the new poor weren't in any kind of other registry. So they are not be part of any program. They are not beneficiaries of any program. The third is that without the emergency and the emergency decrees, it would have been impossible to have all these cross-checking between databases. It would have been impossible because the government is not flexible enough to do that. They even share information with the humanitarian community, but the welfare humanitarian actor. And finally, I will say that it will be very difficult to dismantle all this kind of transitional infrastructure that has been put in place to respond to COVID-19. I mean, and the government decided to extend one of the programs that was set up to a cash transfer program that was set up to respond to COVID, and now it has decided to extend it. But when you decide to extend the program, everything falls into place. So you cannot have the quick kind of thing that you did before, and now everything have to be set up like a large operation that these kind of big programs need in order to operate. That's it.
Thank you, Tanya. Very interesting. So we're hearing a lot about the benefits of using existing data, but also the challenges in terms of this data being up to date, relevant, and so on. Anybody else who's interested? I see that Philip is raising his hand virtually. Philip?
Just to complement what has been said by Alan and Tanya, one important thing is that, like as Alan mentioned, each country has its own particularity. And in many countries, the social registries, they are not yet at the speed to be able to respond to a shock. They are still, like, if you think about the evolution of social registry, we are at the early stages of it. And in many countries that even have large social registry, they were established in like 5 years ago, 4 years ago. So they are still in the first wave of updates. Like there are very few like large countries as Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, they are long, but most of the countries that are like in developing countries, they are starting this. So in a way, the social registry is still not developed to be dynamic as it should be to respond to a shock, or ready to be able to be expanded in the short. However, countries that had programs targeted through the social registry could answer the COVID to respond not to the new poor, to these people that were affected, that lost employment, but those who were already receiving some sort of support. Because the COVID has affected the both, like the already poor, that they do not have ways to cope with the crisis, and those who lost employment and they are now becoming poor and they're invisible, as Tanya mentioned, right? So in many countries, we could use the social registry for an immediate response for the poorest households or for the most vulnerable households, not necessarily those who were directly affected by the COVID with like some kind of loss because of the lack of dynamism of the registry, right? And in these countries, even if the countries like, we have countries like Brazil, Peru, Congo, Senegal, Palestine, that they use the social registry, all the information directly, like they could transfer the money to people without collecting extra data very fast. However, it's covered only a small segment of the population. So all these points that Alan mentioned about the need for adding for new applications, cross-verification, that was done in parallel so that they could increase the response. But it's like, it's not enough, can be useful, and that is a good call for all of researchers in this area and policymakers about how to make the social registry more dynamic, more interoperable with the other database to speed up in the near future responses like that. Over.
Thank you, Philip. Very interesting. Okay, let's go for another one. I see that Tina is raising her hand. Yes.
Thanks, thanks, Rodolfo. And I just wanted to complement that by saying, I think what we're seeing mostly with the COVID-19 shock response programs is that they've been piggybacking on the regular social assistance systems. And as Felipe was just saying, the social registry, the development of social registries, and particularly dynamic social registries, have been rather nascent. So it's really piggybacking on existing beneficiary registries and beneficiary operations management systems that we call MISs that we've seen happening. And in terms of that horizontal expansion of social registries, we see that the core beneficiaries of SP systems, at least in Africa and West Africa, the core beneficiaries of SP systems are the ones that were able to reach. And those who are not in receipt of regular benefits, but have been affected by the shock, and these are mostly the informal, non-poor, vulnerable, and then informal, non-poor, non-vulnerable, those are the people that we want to expand to, which is that missing middle, right? And we're not really seeing that, that most of the systems in countries are equipped to do that without having some sort of a universal interoperable foundational unique identity platform to do so. So in order to not have that excess data collection from the get-go, one of the things that we have been trying to help set up is expand the reach of universal foundational ID platforms that then allow you to layer data on top in order to bring in new people to enable that dynamic social registry. So I just wanted to complement that as well.
Right, Tina, many thanks. Thanks also for raising the issue of beneficiary registries and the importance of these registries. It's not just about social registries and so on. So great, thank you very much. So now let's move to the second question. Meanwhile, let me say that there is a lot of material describing how social registries have been used in the response to COVID, and some of it is being shared in the chat box, and will also share the rest of some other material in the Google document later on. So the second question is the following. What aspects do we need to focus on during the design phase to ensure that the data collected for COVID-19 related social protection programs are easy to share for use in future social protection programs, so that tedious data collection doesn't have to be repeated? So how can we ensure that the data that is collected at this stage can be used in the future? I see that Ralph is already raising his hand. Ralph, to you.
Yeah, now that I found the button, I can do so. Cool. No, thanks. And I just want to connect to a few points which were mentioned before. I think, I mean, one point obviously is the point which was mentioned by Tina on the foundational ID system. So it does, I mean, in order to make use of any data collected, in addition, obviously, we do have the question of, can we merge data with unique identifiers, or are we focusing on regions or areas where we clearly know that information about the people haven't been collected yet, and so we don't have at the end duplication which we cannot solve. I think that's one of the questions. The second is certainly also the question of, is despite the felt urgency to go out and to have a corona response, maybe we need to act quick now. Is there time to essentially be mindful about what is data which we might need beyond the very immediate response, and I think that's really a challenge, because there is obviously an urgency to react and to get going, and everybody's expecting that from you in government and supporting partners. But if we can build on something which is a consensus, for instance, on a harmonized questionnaire where data is being collected with, and which is maybe rapidly reviewed in the light of new thoughts about saying, well, it hasn't been designed with a pandemic in mind so far, so are there aspects which you need to be adding? But then maybe it is a good way to get started with. But I think also the last one is an institutional question: who goes out and collects the additional information? So is there at all, between the institutional players, a possibility to share the data? So if it's a government in control of doing that, and the same ministry or government or whatever, which is running a central register, then obviously it might be a more easy task. But if it is a parallel, potential humanitarian response carried out by external stakeholders, which which might need to operate under a different set of principles, it might be more challenging to find an agreement here, which is acceptable for all sides, because it's also not the same, basically consent being given by the beneficiaries to use the data beyond the immediate reply. And I think that's something which is very challenging to solve in a situation of stress. And it's much better, if we basically get prepped for these things beforehand.
Great, Ralph. Many thanks. I see that Veronica is raising her hand.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This applies both to the previous question, but also to this one. And I was actually waiting for Ralph to make this point, but he didn't. So I'm going to make it now. I get a little bit uneasy about assuming that all we need to solve is the willingness to share data and ensure systems are interoperable. I think there are really important questions around accountability and data protection that also needs to be kept in mind. And we can't just throw them out because we're now acting in emergency situation. And if we do throw them out to a certain extent because there is a huge need for action, then maybe after the emergency has calmed down a little, we should go back. And I mean, there is this notion of informed consent. There's an importance of data. There's a principle of limiting the data that is being collected. So, I mean, and I think these are really, really important. And we have had many cases of data abuse and problems. And so even if we need to act at scale and be quick, we still need to also be careful about what we are doing. And it was great to hear about the emergency decrees in Colombia, so that clearly at least there was a legal backing for this to take place. But I still wonder that, I mean, this massive permission of exchanging data, including also the private sector, I mean, how is this going to be handled in the future? I mean, was there a time limitation to this? I mean, I think all these questions of how do we handle data are really important to still keep in mind when we operate emergency responses and also everyday social protection responses.
Thanks, Veronica, for raising the important issue of accountability, privacy, security, and so on. Anybody else wants to comment on this question, on this topic? I see Rachel. Do you want to?
Oh, yes. One thing I would just add briefly is and this actually perhaps looks ahead a bit to one of the questions about whether some of the enrollment approaches adopted during the pandemic might also be used for, regular non-pandemic era social protection programs. And I do think this is a question of, literally just the types of data that are being collected in this unusual circumstance. So for example, the example I was discussing in answer to this question this morning was a really interesting program in Togo, which is completely digital first, so enrollment done, via USSD menu. And the targeting, data was simply people had to submit their their voter identification number and their occupational category, and it was aimed at people in the informal sector. This is a really interesting set of data that probably bears almost no resemblance to the type of data that would typically be used to enroll people into a program via a proxy means test. So I think there's also a question of simply figuring out, to what degree is this generating valuable data that can be ported over into an existing social registry or another database, and to what degree would that data have to be then, potentially validated in some completely duplicative manner, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you. Very interesting. Philip?
Very quickly to add 2 points. One is is what Ralph mentioned in terms of the questionnaire, right? What we have seen in few countries where they plan from the beginning, where the government is in control of the response, and there is a unit in charge of the social registry that can be dynamic, was that the preparation of a short version of what would be the full questionnaire for a social registry, based on adding few questions that are COVID related, but keeping the basics of identification as the core. In what sense that goes to what Rachel mentioned is after the COVID, because this is specific, the targeting is specific for COVID. So after the COVID, you can revisit all these questionnaires and invite people to complement the information that could feed into the full social registry. And that is an approach that can be useful for any crisis. And I think this is how you can actually simplify and think about when you are designing a social registry or whatever, what is the basics, kind of basic question that would allow you to identify individuals and households in a generally speaking, not about targeting for a specific program. And these questions should be collected by any agents that would be doing emergency or humanitarian activity, so that you can actually make sure that you can later on revisit this household and incorporate them in the registry. Over.
Thank you, Philip. I think both Alan and Tina were raising the hands. Tina, do you want to start, and then we move to Alan?
Okay, thank you, Rodolfo. I want to follow up on Togo, as they're one of my counterparts, the Novisi program, but I'll come back to that. I'm going to respond to the question here on what aspects do we need to focus on to ensure data collected for COVID-19 programs are easy to share. And, just thinking about what kinds of resources we're seeing. One is, how do we expand using existing data? And so that's the first piece, right? So that is by pulling data together through data sharing arrangements and cross checks. And as Veronica was saying, making sure you have the appropriate data protection measures in place, but then you pull this data together from various administrative systems across government, as well as that intake of beneficiaries from existing programs that I talked about earlier, including those who may be on waiting lists of current programs. And there are a number of countries that are looking into potentially doing these sorts of things. For example, Liberia, Burkina are looking into these aspects. The second is, how do we reach people who are not in any of these existing programs or databases, which is what we were trying to speak to, which is that intake of new registrants through on-demand applications. And this is Togo's Novisi program, which is an example where they're not in existing programs, you want to reach them. And so you're not using PMT or any sort of means testing, but this is straight away a filter based on existing data that you have from the voters ID population. And let me just speak to that a little bit. So they have about 3.6 million people in the voters ID in Togo. These are individuals above the age of 18. And about 1.6 million people applied, and about 567,000 people were ultimately registered for this program based on these filters of what was their occupation and whether they were in a specific geographic area. So that's another sort of source that we're seeing for intake and registration. And then going to Rachel's point earlier, what we're doing with the Nuvisi platform, the government has a lot of ideas and plans to build on the Nuvisi platform and create a broader social protection platform, if you will, that allows for this dynamic intake and registration. So we're financing that through an existing regional program, and that's certainly something that we're looking to as a really promising option. So the number 3 in terms of new data sources would be, that is assessment of potential targeting and accuracy, because that's something that we're not able to do. You have all of these filters, and you can't really go through the filters to get to that level of eligibility. And so we're seeing, and I think many of us are seeing, the exploration of predictive models to look at high priority clusters of vulnerability. And we're seeing this in a number of countries, including Zimbabwe, Togo, Nigeria, and others, where you use a bottom-up approach of looking at more on-demand mobile surveys and questionnaires to then match up with a top-down approach of geographical information systems and maps that can look at high priority clusters. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Alan?
Oh, thanks. I guess just to complement what the others have said, very similar points, I think it's very important to recognize the trade-offs in moving towards these dynamic systems, because unless the data you're accessing are timely and accurate, and unless the institutions are equipped to provide it, you're going to find it brings in problems. I'm thinking, for example, of the South African government's decision to use data on eligibility for unemployment insurance from formal employment. And that data was not accurate, and it was not rapidly available. And so it led to a couple of million people being denied benefits, which later on was reversed, but only after a process of complaint and assessment. So those data sets have to be timely. And the other point is to reinforce this issue of data protection. I think that the COVID pandemic is going to lead to a huge jump towards integrated data sets, because we all recognize that having the data sets in data in silos is not an effective way of managing this kind of emergency. And I think there are very few governments yet that have a coherent strategy for dealing with integration of data. I mean, we have a case like Estonia, which has very strict protocols on data sharing, which can integrate across databases with protections. But most countries do not have that. Even most advanced countries don't have that. And that I think is going to be the next big challenge coming out of this.
Great, thank you, Alan. Thank you very much. Okay, now we move to the third question, which is, let me read the question. I have just shared it to the chat box. Any good practice on data sharing within governments, but also with other actors? It is an obsession. It is an obsession on the humanitarian side. Okay, good. So, any experiences in relation to sharing data with within governments, but also with humanitarian actors? Not sure that, yeah, Tanya, I was hoping that you would want to answer this question. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I already mentioned it, what happened before with the Colombian government. I just want to connect with the latest answer, because in Colombia, we went from zero flexibility from the government, zero, to any way of reacting to emergency. We received 2 million migrants coming from Venezuela, and still the state, the social protection agencies didn't react, and they reacted to respond to COVID, because of course it has been massive. So we have now great, from zero flexibility to great flexibility, including data sharing, for example, specific in data sharing, and they also have been able to include migrants, which is a huge step. I think it was one of the first countries in the region. We do so follow up about that, and Colombia had this. To respond to Veronica before, also what happened here is with the decrease, they stopped because the emergency has like a limited period of time, so they stopped. But during this flexibility, the humanitarian community was also able to connect with the government and to share information with the government. We know of 2 agencies, of course, the World Food Program. They set up a pilot to complement the response from the state. So they provide cash transfer using this the data information, the social registry from the government. So they share with them, with the World Food Program, more or less over 30,000 registry information about 65,000 people, between Colombians and migrants too. And they also share a little, in a lower and a smaller proportion, information with other local actor in order to provide humanitarian assistance to people. So there was the flexibility. It wasn't that easy to get, but they opened up. But what they asked for was for data sharing agreement, very specific, asking the international community or to the World Food Program not to share the information and use it only for these kind of purposes. So I think this shows how, I mean, we have to get to the trade-off, as someone mentioned it before, because we have been asking in Colombia, for example, asking the government to be more flexible, and it finally did it. So I think in some way we have to appreciate, we have to be alert, but at the same time we have to value they have done it. And in Colombia, this is the case.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanya. Very interesting. I think Ralph, you've raised your hand. Is it correct?
I'll follow later. I don't want to interrupt that discussion. I want to come back to the data protection topic. I think I need to make a.
Okay, so let's ask Philippe to answer, and then we go back.
No, one point about this government and agencies, international agencies, humanitarian, has to do with like misalignment of priorities at one point in time and misdialogue, if I can use this word, misdialogue. In what sense? In many cases, like the humanitarian start acting, collecting data without considering the government as a partner that could later on take over, or could later on be part of the system and use the humanitarian not about collecting data, but as a channel for response. So what we see, like I experienced a few cases, like in my engagement during this lifetime at the World Bank, is that where like humanitarians come at one point and say like, I done my work, now it's up to you, the government, to take over my beneficiaries and provide some support for them. So you have like budget implications to do that. You have like issues in terms of like the quality of the data that was collected. So my recommendations is like, if the approach is to link and to have a strategy where recurrent, like regular social protection and programs can be used for emergency and also can work under the emergency case, let's bring the agents together beforehand. Let's define the overall strategy where each agent will know exactly what are the roles and responsibilities. Once you have that, you can define a strategy for data collection that will be harmonized, because the data quality matters a lot. If you do not pay the attention on the data quality, on data privacy, you cannot be able to have this data collaboration as we would like to. So the countries that are able to do a proper response, like you have Chile, example is the best. Like you have at one point, like Chile is very prone for shocks, right? Natural shocks. Now, like the emergency system is linked to the national system. So they do not need to collect all the data in times of shock. They just go to a place and collect the damage assessment, and they are able to provide support. And another point that it's important is in terms of, there is a misunderstanding that is it's common, is about like the government and the targeting. We are talking here about data. Data is not about targeting. Registry is not about targeting, right? For us to be able to respond to people, we need to have information about people. Each program will have their own approach to identify their beneficiary, right? So if we want to have this coordination, we have to understand that we have to harmonize many concepts. Sometimes like we see humanitarians saying that, oh, I will target on food security, or I will target under the vulnerable. And at the end of the day, we are all talking about the same population, but one called food secure, the other one called vulnerable, the other one called monetary poor. So we have to harmonize basic concepts around so that we have the data that allow us to go for this population when they are in need. So I would call for more, is not like good experience. We have like in Palestine, World Bank, not World Bank, EU, WFP, and the government, they work pretty close together under the same approach to respond to regular social protection and to shocks. So the four institutions, you know, working pretty close together. So there are many examples, but we have to bring all to the same table and discuss before anything happens on the ground. Over.
Thank you, Felipe. Anybody else wants to answer this question? Tanya, good. Back to Tanya.
Sorry, I just want to go to be a little bit controversial with Philip, because I think, I mean, it's good. It will be good. It will be nice if everybody can coordinate and then go to all the international community, coordinate, and then go to talk to the government and get a shared data agreement and everything like this. But I think it's not. It's very complicated. It's very difficult because we are in emergency like the COVID, but also because there are so many actors with it in the humanitarian community. In Colombia, we have plenty of NGOs, UN agencies, and everybody else setting up cash transfer programs. So to getting everybody into agreement, you know how is it. You know how the organizations and the NGOs are very complicated, the UN agencies. That is not even possible within the international community to coordinate and to do data sharing. We cannot do it between ourselves. We are trying a unique identifier, and it's already quite complicated also to do. It's like it's an important step, but still is small for the amount of actors in Colombia. So I think, I mean, to be realistic and in order to respond, because the government had to respond and everybody has to respond to this massive shock, it could be a little bit naive to think that it will be possible. I think maybe what we can do is kind of take examples, like for example, the pilot I mentioned it before between the government and the World Food Program, and from there take lessons so other actors can do the same, I can do it better. But on the contrary, I think even if it's good, and I think it's something that we should aim at, it's very complicated. So it's so complicated to do. Thank you, Rod.
Thank you, Tanya. Tina?
I'm going to go after Ralph because I want to talk about data protection.
Good. Ralph?
Great, because it was mentioned so often. I thought, you know, I think also building on the point that we might leave the crisis with a bunch of more developed systems and or systems which we want to connect better. And as Veronica mentioned early on in the session, we will need to think better about what it means for data protection. At the same time, also we need to recognize that very often the people, maybe thinking about system building and so on might not be, or thinking about how to build the social protection sector might not be data protection expert at the same time, and the data protection expert might not be a social protection expert. So it's a bit of a dilemma of you rather know one better than the other. And so just to mention in this social protection interagency cooperation board's working group on digital social protection, we are trying to work on a handbook, on basically a guideline, a checklist for practitioners to think through implications for data protection, and we hope we can make that available in relatively soon to practitioners across. I mean, obviously, it would have been nice to have that prior to COVID, but that were, I think COVID was a bit faster than we were. So we beef up on that side a bit. I think that's really something we need to jointly pay more attention to in the next year to iron out wrinkles which might have arisen in the past few hectic steps.
Thank you, Ralph. Tina?
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on the data protection piece, and and thank you so much, Rolf, for coordinating the data protection principles and the declaration. And this is something that we see as enormously useful. Now, in terms of the kind of specific pieces that we're trying to put together in some of the countries that we're working with, we are looking at technical assistance with our legal colleagues to extend to specific legislation, ministerial orders, program protocols, implementation tools, information security, these sorts of data protection pieces and artifacts that enable some protections in terms of the personally identifying and socioeconomic information. This is something that we don't really talk about quite often in the social protection sector, and we certainly believe that we need to be talking about this with respect to data sharing. And if you look at the OECD's privacy guidelines, we're now putting together, in fact, a paper on data sharing and data protection, specifically looking at the OECD guidelines, that one, in terms of collection limitation, that SB actors, we need to be exercising some kind of restraint in the collection of beneficiaries' data so that there's a sort of a purpose specification or purpose limitation. And it's not, you're not collecting all sorts of data under the sun, and thinking that this is going to be useful at some point in the future. And then the second is in terms of the data quality, that is having accurate, complete, and timely data, and using a more of a human-centered design approach. And then purpose limitation, of course, that we talked about, but then use limitation as well. That is, when you share the data, the use of that, there should be limitations on what that is meant to do in terms of use. And then having security safeguards so that the appropriate technology as well as procedural safeguards are in place. And openness, that is, we need to be talking about how personal data is used generally, and even disclosing that to the people who are providing that data to you, to say, how are you going to be using that data, and using that clear, frequent, periodic communication. And then finally, in terms of accountability, which Veronica had touched on, that is, we need to be having some sort of a governance mechanism for accountability, and some sort of participatory approach, so that if it is required that certain kinds of data need to be erased or challenged or rectified or amended, there should be protocols and processes to do so. So there's just so much around this. I think we bandy about this word and this phrase data protection, but we, as a social protection community and a delivery systems community, we need to be talking about this in a lot more specific detail as to the actions that we're going to take with respect to data sharing. And I want to give a shout out to our colleague Conrad, who's a lawyer on our team, who specifically looks into these issues for us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tina. I wanted to see if anyone who hasn't spoken yet wants to answer this question or any of the previous ones and engage in these discussions. If so, I mean, you can just unmute your mic and let us know, because I'm not able to see everyone on the screen. Anyone interested in sharing his or her views? Okay. So otherwise, we move to the third question, which is probably the final one. Can you please give examples of innovative and digital approaches to outreach, registration, and enrollment? Are these approaches likely to be adopted by social protection for regular programs? We've been focusing a lot on using existing data and sharing data, no? So it may be good to deal with the issue of innovative approaches to collecting new data, no? So I don't know if anyone wants to provide an example of experiences in relation to collecting new data, registering new beneficiaries with innovative approaches. So, Philippe.
I'll give the example of Brazil. So Brazil, like as Alan mentioned at the beginning, like when they went, so Brazil has a social registry that covers a large share of the population, but at the time that the crisis hit, a lot of people that lost jobs, they were not in this database, in the Cadastro Único. So what they did, the government, through the administration that managed the social registry, the Cadastro Único, they created an app that was managed by, and it was developed pretty fast by the administrators, the IT team. And this app would collect basic information and would link you to the emergency program very fast. It was a very simple app, but this app had the national, Brazil does not have one unique national ID, it has different IDs. So they use the social security number, we call CPF, to be the link with different databases so that they could do some cross verification. Now, they are in a phase where this digital platform can be part of an entry point for claiming and registration on the social registry. So they're trying to integrate these two. The Cadastro Único has an online and offline system, but you have to walk through they call the Center of Social Assistance to enroll. So they are trying to figure it out now if they can have this this online where you can do an application as they did for the emergency program online, but then you go to the center just to complement and to present some required documents to verify that you are who you are in a way. So it's like combining like the digital world, but not avoiding the need for a physical verification at one point to get signatures and all the documentation needed to back up, because the Cadastro Único, according to the regulations, requires some verification procedures in person. So this is how they are doing. So they are like using this innovative approach of like the online, but trying to integrate into the traditional world to make it even more accessible for people to apply for it. This is one example. And Peru did something similar also on that. Over.
Great, thank you. Yes, there are a few examples in Latin America. Let me see. Okay, so Tina, you raised your hand. I think this is gonna be the last answer, then I have to wrap up.
Okay. All right. So I in fact, I can flesh out the Togo Novisi example, since You know, a lot of people know about Novisi, but I can give you some of the details around Novisi. So essentially, you know, I'm going to break it down using the delivery chain that we laid out in the source book on the Foundations of Social Protection Delivery Systems. So in terms of the outreach, intake, and registration, they're doing what we call dynamic inclusion, right? So it's supported by proactive campaigns through radio and television, social media, Twitter, Facebook, and they use a really user-friendly website that describes the objectives of the program, and it tells you how can you register and how can you receive a benefit. And then the intake and registration is done through a USSD messaging platform that can be accessed by dialing *855 hashtag. And you can do this through conventional mobile phones. So that's, you know, you can do it to the lowest feature phones. You don't need a smartphone to do the intake and registration. And so they use that platform to provide some basic information about themselves. And as I said earlier, about 1.4 to 1.6 million people registered using this method. The next is, you know, what we call the stage of eligibility assessment and enrollment decision and onboarding. And here's where the eligibility criteria worked out. So number one, the criteria was being a Togolese national or a resident, then being at least 18 years old, as we had talked about earlier, having that voters. And again, they used voters as a pragmatic, it was a very pragmatic response because they're currently in the process of implementing a foundational unique ID platform that's not linked to nationality or legal status, and that will register the entire population, about 10 million. So they recently passed a law, maybe just a couple of weeks ago, the electronic identification law that enables all of these things to happen. So they only use voters for the crisis. So I want to clarify that. And so the voters also, along with that, the other criteria they used was being a resident of a specific geographic area that was covered by the lockdown. So it was Lomé and Chaozhou. So there were some two specific areas that had lockdown measures that they used in order to filter people. And then they looked at whether you were in the informal sector and were at risk of losing labor income due to the COVID-19 measures. And specifically, I think hairdressers, tailors, these are some of the people that ended up being registered. So during that registration process, you know, going down from the intake and registration to enrollment, they enrolled about 567,000 people in the program. So I'm making a distinction between registering that 1.7 and then finally enrolling the 567,000 into the Novisi program, of which about 65% were women and 35% were men. So they actually had an emphasis on registering and enrolling more women than men. And in terms of the level of benefits provision, they also had about, I think it was about 12,000 francs CFA for women and about 10,500 francs CFA for men. So that was just to give you a few details about Togo's Novisi program, and I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're running out of time.
Rodolfo,
yes, Philip.
If I may very quickly, Republic of Congo is also an example. They just created, they have also a similar approach where the application for any program, you should go to the CRAS, that is the Center of Social Assistance, and they developed an app with the Airtel, the cell phone company. So actually you can apply to Airtel and be eligible or not for the emergency program. And this information is incorporated now to the main social registry that they are developing. And this technology about claiming application through the cell phone and then going to the center to complement the information, it's likely to be continued as part of like the citizen, center citizen, I forgot the name, that you use design, like you just put in the individual closer to the application. Over.
Great, thank you, Philip. Very interesting. Great. So yeah, we're running out of time. I'm not going to attempt to summarize this great discussion. We covered many topics, and I think we could be discussing this for hours and hours. We covered issues related to using existing data, sharing data within governments with other organizations, coordination issues, data protection, and also accountability. And now we've been discussing recently the issue of innovation, how to identify people that are not already in the system. So there are a lot of resources have been shared in the chat box during the clinic. So I invite you to check those resources. Please remember that the conversation continues in the discussion forum on the Google document. Please do provide your inputs. And this is for the experts, but also for all the participants. And well, many thanks for joining. I'm sure I'll see you in the other sessions and of this event and other things. Thank you very much, and well, see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.